a key aspect that is often not talked about, it's not readily talked about, is financial stability and its impact on anything that is related to risk. So that means it's extremely important for entrepreneurship. Thinking about where your stability actually lies, what that actually looks like. So, what am I actually talking about with financial stability? And why is it so important to me? Why do I think this is a sort of critical um, thing that's not a critical topic that's not talked about enough? Um, so, what am I talking about? Financial stability. It's not necessarily about the resources that you actually have on hand, but it's thinking about living within the resources that you have on hand, right? So it's not a measure of sort of wealth, but it could be. But what I'm more or less talking about is, are you able to work within the resources that you have, right? So if you make $15,000 a year, um, can you do something entrepreneurial within that $15,000? Can you actually waste some time and effort and money within that $15,000, right? And can you actually live on a regular basis that you feel like that $15,000 is adequate for you? Now, that number might be, $250,000, right? So if you're bringing in $250,000, is that adequate for you to do something entrepreneurial? Are you going to feel stability? And this is a really, it's very much subjective. It's not like a real number that you create, right? Or it's not something that I can say, hey, this is the number that you actually need. It is it's sort of a measure of how you feel about yourself and what you actually need as an individual, right? People can be completely, perfectly content living off of, there is a bare minimum, but like something like $40,000 a year or $30,000 a year, and be perfectly content. Living in an apartment, eating ramen noodles, right? Like doing that kind of stuff and feel completely fine. And if that's the case, and then you could do something that's financially, risky, where you have that sort of stability in your mind, like you're okay with who you are, you don't have to prove to anybody, you have no, basically sort of no wants, then you could do something entrepreneurial. And I think what happens with this, right, is sort of a measure of how you deal with uncertainty. So somebody might be bringing in $250,000 a year, right? Like have a significant income and still feel that they can't do something entrepreneurial because they don't have financial stability, right? So it's more of a perceived number in everybody's head, right? It's not necessarily like this is what you actually need to do something that's entrepreneurial, but it's how you actually feel about the your perceptions of how much money you have and the risks that you can take given with what you actually have. So I mentioned earlier, my goal is to waste about 10% ish of my resources on entrepreneurial things, right? So right now it's a reciprocity project. It'll probably continue to be a reciprocity project for a very long time because I think it's something that can build and grow and turn into something that's really cool, right? Like something that is a real institution, um, that people know and understand within the field, within the broader academic community. I could sort of see this being something that is that has worldwide scientific impact, right? And even still, maybe even broader than that, worldwide just impact. And so, for me, we I make a professor's salary, right? And I have to admit that my wife's also a veterinarian, and so, there is a certain amount that we can sort of waste, right? We can do with these kind of things. Now, this number, and it's interesting. I had this conversation a little while ago where somebody was like, well, it's easy for you because you're a tenured professor. It's like, no, actually, I started this before I was a tenured professor, and I actually deeply regret that I didn't start this during the fact that, when I was a PhD student and a master's student. The only reason I didn't do that um, wasn't because of the financial constraints. It was because I was trying to abide within the social norms of what people thought I should do. And it wasn't until I decided I don't need I don't need to be like that, right? And it had nothing to do with financial stability or anything like that. I would have pursued this much earlier. Um, and in fact it was sort of the feelings of those constraints when I was a PhD student, right, where I felt the lack of financial constraints, where I was like, well, I need to do something about this. I need to actually change this for other people. I need to make sure that other people have the resources that are super easy and cheap to get to. And so I started building this platform, right? The reciprocity platform. And there's just a lot that you can do, right? With There's a lot more that you can do if you perceive yourself as having financial stability. And if you think, and it's interesting because there's actually not a lot of, there's some, but there's not a lot of discussion that I know of within the sort of academic literature looking at financial stability. And I think the reason is it's actually really hard to get that information, and so we don't try to go around that. And we have sort of ideas that we can get money from alternative sources, right? So as a venture, you can get money from venture capital, you can get money from, you can get money from friends and family, and all of those kind of things. And I want you to sort of take a deep dive and think about who are those people that are most likely to do those kind of activities, right? The people that are most likely, and you could see these very strong biases. Um, they might be coming from people that have, backgrounds of, personal wealth, right? So they come from more, wealthier families, for example. They might come from where people understand that sort of financial stability and the importance of financial stability, or they worry about it, right? So I think about, um, I think so, about immigrants, right? Like people coming from another place and they're thinking about financial stability, where they need to come up with ways that they can become more financial stable. So they do a lot of entrepreneurial things, and people sort of neglect these things as not being entrepreneurial enough, right? Like, I really don't like that idea, but these things are really, really important stuff that are very much entrepreneurial. Taxi cabs, right? Driving Ubers today, right, is predominantly, lots of sort of immigrants go into those kind of work, because they're easy to start up, and actually they provide pretty good financial stability, right? There's all sorts of things like that are filled because people are sort of pursuing that financial stability. And as you sort of realize, undocumented immigrants, there's lots of people doing that kind of work that is very much entrepreneurial, right? They are actually pursuing something that has a large amount of risk, and they're pursuing it because it actually has some good, positive returns for them, right? And that's all because of financial stability. The more that you sort of think about our actions in terms of financial stability, where we're either trying to seek to get it, or once we actually have some more financial stability, what do we actually do with that, and how we feel about what we actually have, sort of drives a lot of this behavior, right? Drives a lot of behavior, that might be, considered more sort of risk seeking, I guess, or uncertainty seeking. And I think that's a fundamental driver with what we do with entrepreneurship. At the base of it uh, is because of financial stability, right? So either the fact that you perceive yourself to be financially stable enough that you can be willing to waste some resources on things that are that add value, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of entrepreneurial, financial, commercialized business kind of thing, right? It could be like, I'm going to waste some resources and create a club. I'm going to create a social club, or I'm going to create a non-for-profit, or I'm going to start picking up garbage on the weekends. Like, all these kind of things are very much because you perceive yourself as, I'm financially stable enough that I can actually waste some resources on those things. And then on the other side, right, we do these things because we're trying to achieve financial stability of some sort, right? We might actually get a job that's more entrepreneurial. We might do side hustles, right? Or the reason why people actually might do sort of moonlighting or an extra job is to get some more money, right? It's the idea of why you actually do a lemonade stand as a kid. You want to get some money. In my family, we don't do allowance, but if our kids want to cut the grass or they want to do chores, we pay them. And surprisingly enough, when they want money, they will actually do those chores, right? When they actually want some financial stability to get the things that they actually want, they'll get those chores. But what's interesting, and even more interesting, they actually don't seek out that stuff that much because that they have a tremendous amount of stability in their life, given that that we have financial stability, so then they have that financial stability, right? All of these things, right? Um, all of this stuff, if you think about it, is super important. Where you view yourself as having financial stability, that and you perceive yourself as financially stable, that you're more likely to do things. You know, you're likely to do more things that are going to be more risky, right? You don't know what the sort of probability is, or sort of uncertainty seeking. Or if you're seeking sort of financial stability, you might be going within the domains that sort of allow you to get that those financial returns. That's why when you go into YouTube, you'll see all sorts of videos of sort of get rich quick schemes and people trying to teach you how to make money within a week, right? People are seeking, and there's lots of views, lots and lots and lots of views on all of these videos. And you have to realize it's because people are seeking out this financial stability that's very important to their life, right? They need that. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they need this stability in their life to sort of move up and to get more, self-actualization, right? To get to the point where you're actually self-actualizing and becoming more okay with who you are, right? And it's a very important part. And so once you get to that moment, right, of where you're just okay, you're more willing to, waste resources. So, what's some basic ways to think about financial stability? So, how do you actually get financial stability? So, first of all, you have to remember, again, financial stability is what you make of it, it's what you sort of perceive of it. But I think we have some sort of general principles that we can go by, that can sort of guide what we're actually doing, right? So the first one is think about your revenue and costs that you actually have, right? So revenue is your salary and wages that you bring in, and the costs are affiliated with your life. Now, we all need some basic things in life like food, shelter, transportation, was it and water, right? Like or utilities, right? So you can, if you just have those simple things, and the thing is like, if you start analyzing it, right? So food, what do you need for food? Um, worst case scenario, you can live like you can live extremely inexpensively by eating things like, turnips, right? Very inexpensive. You can eat rice, you can eat beans, like very inexpensive, simple things, spaghetti. Um, you can live fairly modestly, with fairly low costs, right? And then where you live, you can live in a very modest house. And it's really how we think about that, or not house, but home, right? And it's how we think about it, right? So it seems like an atrocity. Now, this is where we have to think about norms violations quite strongly. What does that actually mean? Um, and why don't we actually do that, right? This is an interesting conversation that I have to often have is, you know, we could very easily live in a tent, right? Like most of us could probably do that. And the fact is, almost all of our ancestors did that, right? They all lived in, even in northern Canada, right? Would have lived in a canvas tent, right? An yurt or whatever, like all these kind of things. Really inexpensive, really modest. Our ancestors, you know, my you know, grandparents, they were in Saskatchewan when they immigrated many years ago, and they built one of these homes that are just made out of sod, right? I imagine that's what they built. I don't know exactly what they built, but that's what the homes were like. They cut grass, out of the hillside and built a home out of the grass in the hillsides. Very modest, very simple stuff, right? So our conceptions of what homes can be and what they're about is about norms violations. That is the key thing. What does it actually mean for you to live in the way that you could sort of keep those costs down, right? Thinking about transportation, right? It is often there is a lot of norms. There's a lot of emotional feelings that come with transportation, like tremendous amounts of emotional feelings, right? So the cheapest is walking, right? Or riding a bicycle. Um, I did that for a long time, but that's me. I'm kind of weird, right? Like I'm okay with riding a bicycle. The only reason I drive a car now is I have a family, and I have to pick them up and take them from place to place. Now that they're getting older, they are riding to school a little bit more and doing things like that in their bicycle. But we still need an extra car, to get around and do some things. Doesn't mean that like it isn't norms. It's the norm to have a car, and I can get away. I guarantee I can get away with having a scooter or something less expensive, right? Something that is more modest. And all of that, what we define ourselves as, right, buying a certain car or certain form of transportation, is just norms, right? If you think about this, we often, as a society, we buy these things that are far more expensive than what we can afford, given with what we have. And the reason why we do that is that's what the social norm is, right? We buy this very expensive asset, um, that depreciates in value, that disappears, and we're okay with buying those things because that's the sort of social norms that we have, right? And if we were to deviate from that, ride a bicycle, take city buses, those kind of things, then the perception often, right? Any of those are perfectly fine. When I moved as a assistant professor, I took the city bus for the first year. When I was moved to the place that I'm at right now, the institution that I'm at right now, which was highly unusual, for a professor to actually do that kind of thing, to take a bus, right? So all of these in the city that I live in, all these things are just norms violations that I'm pointing out. That if you're okay with violating those norms, then you can actually live very modestly and keep the costs of your life really low. Now the problem is that you have revenue coming in often, and that revenue coming in allows you to justify the costs of your life, right? And I myself, I'm absolutely, um, absolutely sort of, I don't know what's the word, like this is me. Like I completely understand. I resonate with this a lot. The more money that you actually make, the more revenue that you bring in, the more that you sort of justify the costs and the things that you actually are having, or that you bring in, right? So you get more and more expensive things. Um, and this is what it means to be sort of human beings, right? I think that there's a management scholar named Frank, is his last name, talks about sort of this competitive nature that we have as human beings, where we're sort of competing and doing wanting more given the revenue that we actually bring in. Now, some of us um, actually don't have a high enough revenue, right? Like we just don't bring in enough and it's hard to do. So you might be able to look for ways to increase your revenue in various different ways, right? So what we tend to do is look for the things that are sort of shiny, um, but but often if we're thinking about entrepreneurship, right, and we're thinking about kind of being um, sort of a bumbling idiot with entrepreneurship, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. So perhaps the best way to pursue bringing in additional revenue is to lean in what already is working in your life, or things that are very simple, right? I want you to take a sort of a normative look in your life and think about who is actually bringing in revenue that you would admire or aspire to be in your own life, and what do they actually do, right? It's often not what you would think that they should do, right? It's maybe they just have a plain job as an accountant, right? And you lean into that and then you work harder at becoming that accountant. It's not necessarily entrepreneurship, but it's entrepreneurship sometimes, right? Where you're doing more within your company, more within your firm to garner a wage, or you're just basically doing the same thing as what an entrepreneur does, but within the guise of the organization that you work. And there's virtually no difference between the two, right? I would not you have the if you think about entrepreneurship in this sort of way, right? So entrepreneurship, it could be the sort of typical ways you're getting paid by multiple clients. But if you think of yourself as an entrepreneur, right, somebody who's working for a single company, you're just getting one client, and that one client is that one company, right? And you do your best to serve that one company, and hopefully you increase your wages and salaries that way, the revenue that's actually coming in. So I'm viewing the individual as basically a sole proprietor, right? And then that's everybody. We're all sole proprietors, essentially, right? We're all sort of working for ourselves, for our household income to increase that. Now, once we have this, a significant amount of revenue, we have to think about, um, you know, how is it that, oh, and the other way is, think about sort of guaranteed ways to bring in revenue. Think about the people around you in a normative way. Just think about who is actually making money in your life right now and sort of mimic what they are doing, right? So it's often being accountants. But then you might also think about, hey, I have a friend that's cutting grass and they're doing okay. I should mimic what they are doing, right? So it's not going to be these things that you see on YouTube. It's not going to be, the sort of far off celebrity kind of stuff. It's going to be very practical. And the reason is that you just don't understand, we as human beings don't understand the domain very well, right? We are all somewhat bumbling idiots. We don't necessarily know. So we should follow what's closest within our domain because it's the easiest way, most simplest way to sort of garner, revenue, right? So it might be cutting grass, it might be babysitting. It's just sort of very simple things. Maybe driving Uber, very simple things that I would say that are pretty often somewhat entrepreneurial when you're doing those things. Now, the other thing is to think about, okay, now you have a wage that you're bringing in, and you could bring in more revenue by thinking of the sort of interstitial parts of your life that can actually bring in more revenue, or you could do things that are more exploratory and more sort of risk taking and spending more money, right? So you have this sort of stable base, you have this stability And then you look for, on top of that, a proportion of whatever you could do to do more risky things. So at night, maybe you write a blog. At night, you maybe you go work to build up your experience as a chef, right? You actually get some chefing experience. I don't know if that's the proper term, but you actually go and do these things that you're thinking about being a little bit more entrepreneurial, right? And you build up around that so you can make that leap, right? You get to the point where your side thing is growing so much, it's not that much of a leap, and it's not going to financially hurt you in any sort of way. So it's always having that stability as your core of how to sort of manage this process. Now, with the money that's come in and you're thinking about revenues and costs and those kind of things, well, it's pretty simple to sort of manage this stuff. And there's a lot of great financial books that I'd recommend, personal finance books that are just really good. I do think Dave Ramsey actually has some really good things to say. I'm not necessarily a fan of sometimes his, political efforts and all those kind of things. Wonderful, I understand where it's coming from, but from the most part, there's a lot of great things that are being said in terms of how to manage money. People like The Wealthy Barber, right? The book The Wealthy Barber is a great book. Susie Orman has some great resources out there. There's a number of sort of personal finance gurus that do really good things that you could pay attention to, and they're effectively all very similar, and they're doing very similar things. So essentially, what you're thinking about is how do you manage the sort of ratios in your house so that you are planning for the short term, managing money for the short term, and then also thinking about the long term and trading off some of this income that you're bringing in, the revenue that you're bringing in for the long term, right? So it's vitally important to have security by having an emergency fund, for example, having a moderate sized emergency fund that will last you, maybe it's 4 to 6 months of whatever, your expenses that you actually have. But before you get that, and this is where I actually abide, like a lot of what Dave Ramsey says is great. He's got these baby steps. They're great. You have a $1,000 savings account that you build up. That's your first step. And then you start moving on to, building up this emergency account. And then you think about, along the way, before you do anything, you think about the catastrophic events in your life. What are catastrophic events that could sort of destroy your life? And how do you manage that? How do you manage that with insurances, right? So you get, term life insurance, 20, 25-year term life insurance at 10 times to 13 times the amount of money that you actually are bringing in. The reason is that you need to have some revenue that sort of outpaces the market. You have a quantity of money that, if invested properly, it outpaces the market at essentially at the same rate, and that nest egg never changes. Right, so you invest it, you just get the interest of those investments, and you're doing okay from that going forward. So, thinking about these trade-offs that you make and mitigating risks that you have. So one of the risks that you actually have is you start paying off your house. You get a moderately sized house. Again, this is where we have to violate social norms. Right, so social norms are going to encourage you to buy the biggest possible home given the revenue that you're bringing in. Well, if you want to have excess resources to do entrepreneurial things, you need to live in a very modest home given the revenue that you actually bring in, because that allows you to spend more resources more broadly on different things.
So I think the key to doing more entrepreneurship is actually having stability, financial stability. And so that's making sure that you have minimized all of your possible risks that you can control, right? So that's ensuring that you have health insurance, that's ensuring that if you have dependents, and you only need this if you have dependents, that you have some sort of life insurance. And that's ensuring that you have some everyday sort of rainy day fund of some sort, right? So first of all, a little one, $1,000, which makes total sense to me. And then after that, having a more substantial one. And so the goal is to make sure that you have stability, right? And then thinking about how to remove all of the liabilities in your life where something bad can actually happen. And then after that, it's much more easier to actually take on more risks and more uncertainties because of that stability that you actually have in your life, right? So that's thinking about risks and uncertainties, risks and liabilities in all parts of your life. That could be in your relationships, for example. I think having stability in your relationships, I think, is incredibly important for financial stability. If you sort of think about who are you actually going to invest in, right? If you're making a long-term investment, I often think about this, right? The best possible long-term investment that you can make are in the things that are stable and you understand, you have long-term relationships with. You understand all of the critical, you just have very good signals from being with somebody. It would be kind of foolhardy to invest in assets where you don't have that longevity, because you don't necessarily understand. You're probably going to get burnt if you don't have that longevity, if you don't have that good financial resources. So working on things that help relationships, whatever that might look like for you, whether it's your family relationships, or working on dealing with external relationships and how to have stability with those external relationships, are incredibly important. Now, after all of this, I want to sort of point out that there's also thinking about the inherent risk of putting resources, a substantial amount of resources, in one single asset that you're going to own if you're doing anything that's entrepreneurial, right? So investing in a startup, for example, is a very, very risky thing. You don't necessarily know what's going to actually happen. Now, you can minimize that risk considerably by thinking about social norms violations, but that in and of itself is going to be risky. Right, that action is going to add a lot of stress in your life by violating social norms. It's going to add a lot of stress in your life. So one way that you can minimize the financial risk that you actually have is diversifying your resources in other ways. Right, so thinking about so for example, in the social norms case, if you're thinking about violating some social norms, then you think about how to be stable in others, right? How do you, how do you make sure that you're as stable and sort of square in others, right? And thinking about the ways to sort of mitigate risk, right? So it's much more easier for people to understand that you are taking on risks and doing uncertain things and violating social norms if you have great deals of stability in other areas of your life. Right? And that perception is it's going to be less scary when you stand up and it's going to seem like you actually are doing this on purpose. Or it's going to seem that social norm violation is an important thing for you. Now, the other thing to think about in terms of diversification is to think about you as a sole entrepreneur doing this one risky thing has a great deal of inherent risk that's associated with it. So what you should be thinking about is diversifying your assets, financial assets, right? So as you sort of gain financial stability, what I want you to sort of think about is, how can I take 10% or 15% or 20%, some number, some ratio of everything that you bring in, and diversify it across index funds and good mutual funds that have a long record. So that recommendation is very similar to what you might hear from the other sort of financial gurus that are out there, right? Like the Dave Ramsey's, Susie Orman's, and those kind of folks. But, there's good evidence at this point. In fact, you just have to do index funds if you want to. But mutual funds, I find them kind of helpful because then I have an advisor that helps me out and walks me through things once a year. And it's somewhat helpful for me to have that. But you could certainly do index funds. They certainly are a little cheaper. But there is good evidence at this point, both in financial, financial understanding with the financial folks, right? That diversifying in index funds is one of the best ways that you can improve your risk and have the best possible return. But also, I want you to think about if your endeavor, if your thing that you created goes to zero, how much is it actually going to hurt if you're diversified in other areas? And for the most part, if you're diversified in other areas, it does not hurt. You have that fallback. There's always something there. If you think about diversifying in these index funds, I'll tell you what they are in a minute. When you also think about if the world all goes to crap, the most likely thing that's going to happen, the most likely risk that's going to happen is that your sort of startup venture is going to disappear, right? If there's some weird exogenous event, like, I don't know, some really strange thing, like a pandemic or something along those lines, the most risky venture is going to be the one that is just started up. It's not going to be the Walmarts, the IBMs, the Apples, and those kind of large corporations that we know of. Right, so what are these index funds? Index funds are very simple. What it is you take all of the public companies in the stock market that are owned by the public, right? That's essentially what it is. It's very democratic. And then you rank order them. You put them from biggest to smallest. You can rank order them in different ways, but generally you think about them in biggest to smallest. And then, given that rank order, you take an average of the biggest ones to the smallest ones, and then you essentially just purchase a fraction of all of these different companies, whether it's 5,000, whether it's 500. Sometimes you hear about the S&P 500, that's what it's doing. And then you just purchase a fraction of all those different companies. And so what you're doing, because these are the publicly traded companies that are the top performers, they're often the top performing companies in the world. And so you're diversifying the risk that you're actually going to get by investing 10, 15% in very simple assets. They're not necessarily simple. They're actually really complicated. But, that's the most simplest thing that you can do to diversify all of the risks that you're actually taking. And you think about when you're actually investing and you're thinking about this very uncertain, very risky thing that you have, picking a ratio for your startup of what you should invest in that's manageable for you is important relative to that overall risk. Right? So if you're doing something in a category that's extremely risky, you perhaps should think about investing. So for example, you might be doing, right now it's 2023, cryptocurrency seems like a very risky thing to me. Things that are sort of hyped up at the moment likely not be a risky thing in the future, but is very hyped up. Anything that has a lot of hype, then, investing only a small amount in that thing, right? So maybe 2% of your total wealth or income that's coming in seems like a suitable measure compared to investing all the rest of it in other things that are less risky, more stable. And so what you're doing is you're balancing out your portfolio of having something that's slightly more risky or extremely risky with things that are balanced, that have more longevity, and that are less risky in the long run. And sort of balancing this out and thinking about it with who you are and what you can actually do and how old you are, all these kind of things is an important part of thinking about entrepreneurship. It's not just about doing the thing that's different, but it's also thinking about what is your financial portfolio and how stable that you actually are. So financial stability, I think, is key to managing the entrepreneurial process so that you can actually do more risky things. You could do things and take on different ventures along the way because you have this belief, you have this sort of trust, you minimize all the risks in every possible way that you can.